Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. I have been lax on posting this because it took me forever to get around to reading this draft standard I requested to look at. And now that I've read it and processed it and thought about it, I'm not exactly comfortable with showing you the written text of it, and I just reviewed it right now, and I think we can talk about it without violating any sort of issue with ISO or NISO selling it, because I do have a current copy of it listed for sale. This is ISO 24332, and I did see on the listserv for NASIG that there is a revised edition. So the edition I'm commenting on is actually like the first draft they released publicly. I'm not going to read a whole bunch of it or anything like that. I just anticipate this is going to be a long video because I was kind of blown away by all the things that you don't consider records management wise. I took one class in graduate school in records management and then promptly forgot everything as soon as I left. So without too much further ado, we're going to talk about blockchain. We're actually going to talk about digital ledger technology, but I don't like saying DLT over and over again because it reminds me of BLT and that makes me think of bacon, and it's already close enough to going home time that we don't need to be thinking about bacon. So I'm going to talk to you while we look at this lovely slideshow of images that I AI generated using Poe from Poe.com, the playground bot. Yeah, I tried to make some interesting stuff for blockchain and things, but it did not necessarily want to get inside my head the way I wish it will. Anyway, I'm frustrated with the robots. Let's put it that way. And I will try not to make this more than an hour, but it is a fairly long document. And like I said, I'm not going to read it all, but I do have a whole lot of commentary on a chunk of the sections that you can't necessarily see publicly. So, scope of work, authoritative records, record systems, and records management. That part isn't too surprising. I didn't realize there was already an ISO standard for blockchain and DLT, so that's 22739. Excuse me, trying to move my recording timer out of the way so I can look at my notes. So, alright. So it opens with a nice overview of digital ledger technology. Again, I'm just going to say blockchain because that one's the most well-known. And, okay, it's got like a draw icon, and I did not need to draw. I'm just trying to click. Okay. So, obviously systemic governance of records, control of record systems, and blockchain is designed to be final and immutable, which is going to pose some issues, as we'll see in a little while. Yeah, we all kind of know what metadata is. So context, structure of records, as well as management over time. So those of us that do metadata in a library sense don't necessarily encounter this. And you analyze records for management, and that's called appraisal. And then you have to make sure you capture stuff appropriate to business activity, and then, figure out when you can get rid of them. The whole lovely life cycle of records management. I probably should have put a slide up for that, but I did not. So yeah, classification schemes, access permission rules, disposition authorities. This is the sort of stuff that like just made me fall asleep in my first graduate program where I'm like, nope, I see why those guys get paid the good money. But yeah, smart contracts can enforce other types of integrity conditions, can also be legally binding, so it's kind of important to get a good sense of the reference architecture. Let's see. So they talk about like different views. So you have like the user view, the people who are using the system, and then like the functional view, which is grouped into like these layers. And then it talks about like system views. So you have like infrastructure, cross-layer, governance, compliance, cryptography. It's complicated. Anyway. Most DLT systems will differ in 5 important aspects: access, authorization, ledger structure, smart contract capability, and their consensus mechanism. And then they go into a discussion on how, like, even if you get a permissioned blockchain system set up, that doesn't necessarily mean it's private. It just means whoever you gave the permissions to can participate. So yeah, permission versus permissionless, and I'm not going to go too far into that because hopefully if you're listening to this you already know what that means. It talks about like fragmenting ledgers into multiple shards for scalability, which I talk a little bit about in my article. I'm going to skip this Turing complete thing. Yeah, And then they talk about, Bitcoins, Nakamoto consensus, proof of work versus proof of stake. Again, this is stuff I got into in my article, and it is pretty important to like understand that you don't necessarily need to go into like proof of work, Nakamoto consensus level to do distributed ledger technologies. All right. So they have tokens, and tokens can represent other digital assets, or they can represent physical things. You can have intrinsic value, or they can have extrinsic value, and you can also use them for tracking stuff. And then we get into consensus mechanisms and exciting stuff here. So, yeah, descriptions of distributed ledgers. And so, first and foremost, you need to do appraisal in order to determine whether they should have records at all, and then whether or not records need to be kept on or off ledger. And that's, okay, there we go. I know I tried to do like blockchain ring, blockchain taking over. Yeah, my prompts were not great. And this was kind of the interesting thing that I hadn't thought of. So yeah, that can affect the authenticity, reliability, integrity, and usability. So you have to keep in mind stuff you want to keep on ledger, maybe legally enforceable, and that sort of thing. The other reasons they list are like necessary for proper functioning, to embed the reference metadata, because you need to have pointers. So you also have to have links back and forth to stuff that's on and off ledger. They call this the archival bond in archival science, which is something I have forgotten now that I am, oh my god, how many years out of my graduate program. I graduated in 2009, and it was a lovely time. So reasons to keep stuff off a ledger is like not bogging down your blockchain ledger, storage constraints, trying to integrate things with already existing systems, and then, good old privacy and legal reasons. So metadata can be embedded into the records itself, it can be stored on or off ledger, it can make links. So yeah, the requirement that DOT systems protect integrity is not exactly sufficient, because you can prove that it's like integral record, or a record that's not been tampered with, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's got like its audit logs or its chain of custody logs and things like that, which is something, again, I didn't think about. So yeah, from the records management point of view, processes to validate and verify the creator and the actions they can take are core components in ensuring authenticity, which makes sense. So you have to be able to determine that the records have been created by the agents. So permissionless ones like Bitcoin do not require verification, but they do have an identifier because you have a digital wallet. Again, this is something I went on about in my article. You don't necessarily need to be a legally identifiable person to possibly contribute to a ledger technology that might be helpful. Okay. So yeah, identifiers, and they go into that a little bit with linking identifiers and reliability. So, are you reliable? Records are reliable if they are like created at the time of the event, again, pretty basic record management stuff. Completeness of transaction, and they talk about like integrity. So even though they're like intended to be immutable, they being the ledgers, they have fixity that cannot be deleted. So that's good for evidence, as we'll discover in a little while. This is actually like misleading, because you can still change records for doing migration, disposition, digital preservation, but then it messes with the hashes that you need in order to make blockchain work. So it's kind of a conundrum on that one. So for example, like this one, maintaining linkages that document, relate transactions to ensure records are usable, that's good, but how exactly do you do this? And it talks again a little bit about in the next section. So you can store them on a distributed ledger, the hash references, instead of actually storing the entire ledger on it. But they need to be archived separately in a form that is unchanged and inviolate if you are going to do off-ledger records. So this allows for later comparison with the hash value stored to check the integrities, and then again, if they are migrated forward with digital preservation, the hash value will no longer work. So it's kind of a circle yet again. So again, you might have to link the identity of the creator and link those hashes up together and Just sounds like a bit of a, yeah, a bit of a sticky mess to me. Yes, it does. Okay. So I'm just dragging this down so I can see where my page number is. I'm like, where am I? So I can flip this lovely set of slides I made, even though there's not many images. Okay. So yeah, they explicitly state that like they're not necessarily designed to capture records according to records management standards. Once again, this is another case of, hey, we made the tech and it works, but we didn't think about all the exciting legal and business implications. So for example, they don't have functions for creating relationships between like the record and other records. Blockchain is great at creating records that link to each other in succession, but you can't really link them to their procedural context or like agents and other entities that interact with them. So yeah. I talk about access control here, so you can implement authorization with or without identification by approving anonymous transactions that meet specified criteria, and then you can, make happy-dappy cryptographic keys in order to sign your transactions, and yeah, extra setup, but might be worth it if you're doing exciting legal stuff. And then it talks about storage. So there's like ISO 15489, which talks about like physical storage, exciting like disaster recovery things. But yeah, there's like four or five different configurations for ledger systems, and that's records being stored on the ledger, being stored off the ledger, but linked to metadata that itself is on the ledger. Being stored off the ledger, but in a centralized data store, so some sort of like cloud-based database, but not a blockchain. Stored off the ledger in a decentralized data store, interplanetary file system. Okay, I think that's kind of like locks, but I truly don't know. I'm just spinning things. Do not listen to me on that one. All right, so like the decentralized characteristics is an advantage because, there's a bunch of nodes that are replicating stuff, and that increases the likelihood that the data will remain accessible. However, that kind of undermines authoritativeness because we have, how exactly do we agree that blockchain records are authoritative and coming from the right person and all of that good stuff. So yeah, and then again, we just mentioned the preservation problem of constantly having to change hash values. And there's, the usual cloud computing environment risks, the extensive data storage risk, but again, this can be mitigated to some extent by doing like root hashes and then storing the hashes and making all sorts of happy-dappy miracle trees, again, more in my article. Yeah, so they talk about printing of the blockchain, and yeah, I'll go into miracle trees, but that's what miracle trees do. They prune the blockchain. They also talk about like trying to access and use ledgers outside of a ledger system. So, trying to extract it for court, trying to figure out a way to preserve relationships among them and between other records off ledger. And again, it limits its ability to be like an authoritative record. It's authoritative to itself, but it's not necessarily authoritative when it comes to business. So some suggestions, like, explicitly setting a procedure for obtaining an authoritative record, allowing people into your blockchain system, and interoperability with external systems, which I don't agree with, because a backdoor for one person is a backdoor for everyone. So this is a great case in which we need the law to catch up with reality. So we talk about, ISO 13008 if you want to talk about exciting records processes for maintaining authority and reliability. But yeah, I mentioned this already. Conversion of format changes the hash values, and the security and tamper resistance of like blockchain similar technologies relies on the security of the hashing algorithm in both your on-ledger off-ledger systems. So yeah, in theory you cannot convert formats, which is kind of strange. Alright, let's give us a new picture. Okay, I'm trying to remember what that one was. I gave it so many prompts and got so frustrated. Anyway, keeping it moving. So we talk about disposition, which is another thing blockchain technologies are not so great at. So Yeah, they're supposed to be final, definitive, immutable, and who the heck cares about disposition at the end of its life? Again, business reasons. Shredding personal identifiable information, very important. There's cryptographic shredding. I've never heard of chameleon chains, but that could be interesting. The downside is it weakens authoritativeness of your ledger. So, yeah. It talks about, or it refers to actually, this ISO 15489-1, clause 9.9 from the 2016 edition, talking about like destruction of records. So destruction should always be authorized. Records pertaining to legal action should not be destroyed. Duh. While that action is underway or anticipated to rise, records destruction should be carried out in a way that ensures complete destruction and complies with any security or access restrictions. And of course, you should document it like any other disposition action. Yeah, they support process transparency, but there's really like no way to track authorizations for like any sort of off-ledger destruction actions or like segregate your records that need to be saved for possible legal action. Yeah. So you can automate some of that with smart contracts, but it's still in its infancy. ISO 15489 also talks about like the 5 characteristics of record systems. So we mentioned this a little bit: reliable, secure, compliant, comprehensive, and systematic, which keeps looking like systemic to me, but it's not. And for those who aren't so familiar, reliable, can they be continuously and regularly operated? Secure, can you maintain access, control, and monitor things? Compliant, are they legally compliant? Comprehensive, do they manage all the required records? And systematic, routine operation throughout the company. A great idea. Alright, so we have some design considerations for record systems to think about, and again, I'm skipping through a lot of this, mainly because you should pay ISO and all the nice people who worked on this for their hard work. Alright, so yeah, if you have permissioned a system for your blockchain system, you can write explicit rules concerning creation, management, storage, and use in your policy documents, and make sure your operators all follow it. This would include things like scope, relevant, applicable law and standards, possible auditing requirements, business activities, and procedures. In permissionless systems, system-wide records policies are only promulgated, implemented, and enforced by like technical measures. So again, proof of work, proof of stake. Because you can't control humans. You can recommend what they do, but you can't control them unless you can, actually permission them. All right. And again, we're having interesting discussions, and we are not quite reaching consensus on metadata schema quite yet in terms of blockchain technology. So key entities to consider are like records, agents, which are your persons in business functions, mandates, good old laws, and relationships between the entities and the layers of aggregation. There are 6 broad classes of metadata, several which are not found in blockchain systems, and they go into this lovely nice chart, which again I'm not going to spend too much time on, but we have like entity, description, use, which is not in the system right now, event plan, again not in most blockchain systems. Event history, again, any changes in metadata indicates some sort of alteration to the records, so duh, you're not going to have that. Metadata referencing off ledgers for relation does exist, but like half of those did not. So yeah, the act of linking records to the business context is the process of classification, and it supports like the application of access permission rules, appropriate disposition rules, migration to a new environment as a result of organizational restructures. But in the context of blockchains, it can be desirable to link the blockchain with relevant business classification schemes. I know, so exciting. Records management, here we come. Links can be created using several different approaches: embedding metadata, putting version numbers, all the things that throw us when we create metadata. Make yourself some metadata, kids. Make yourself an ontology at home for fun and profit. Okay, maybe not profit. In both permissionless and permissioned DLT systems, rights and permissions can be defined, so you can, set up who can view, who can read versus edit, always an important thing. And disposition authorities are usually authorized, dated, implemented, and reviewed, especially because laws change. And sometimes you need authorization from an external party. Again, not great if you're doing blockchain. And again, having someone who comes in and looks at your blockchain technology system is also difficult because, yeah, do you retain offline copies of ledger records, or do you just let someone in there to scrape it all out like a pumpkin before Halloween? I was gonna say after, but that didn't make any sense, did it now? Alright, so we'll go into some of these nice exciting legal issues they touch on. And yes, this is possibly my favorite creation out of the ones I got, but yeah, I think it was like blockchain ruling the universe or something. I don't know. I should have made a list. Alright, so do the architecture. It can be difficult to determine like what sort of jurisdiction is applicable, if you have to resolve disputes or enforce smart contracts. It cannot be, any transactions cannot be deleted or modified. However, you can sign amending transactions to reverse earlier transactions. Intellectual property, that's a whole nother legal mess. Hi, cousin, who teaches that at Gonzaga. Furthermore, in some jurisdictions, the compilation of the data itself inside the distributed ledger can be its own intellectual property fund. And so you have to clarify the IP rights. It's kind of like combining library records into a database. The compilation of the metadata creates a new entity, which then can be monetized. Anyway, because of that, it can be difficult to determine who's responsible in the error or breach. Same with bugs. Who is responsible for the bug if there's no central authority, and how exactly do you fix it? There's also interesting thoughts here on e-discovery, aka legal discovery for electronic records. So unlike traditional centralized systems, you can get the central registry. There's numerous nodes, and they're not necessarily identical, and they can also be across jurisdictions, which can make things tough if, for example, you are trying to get stuff out of a GDRP country versus trying to get stuff out of America. Very, very, very different laws. So yeah, and also complicate process of identifying custodians, determining who can provide access. Yeah, unlike traditional systems, participants have limited control over the ledger records they generate, so it makes it hard to establish responsibility and accountability. So you have to have cooperation in order to establish clear chains of custody. The plus side is you have immutability of the data that's stored on the ledger, so you can't really modify or delete evidence, so that's kind of a plus. But then again, you have to link it back to things in the real world, which might make it a minus. So yeah, figuring out the authoritative copy. Which, if you think we have a fun time doing that now when we are doing journal cataloging and, managing article access, green OA, gold OA, preprint, postprint, yeah, it gets even more exciting with blockchain technology. Yeah, so what is the official copy? Same with ownership. Theoretically, everyone could claim rights to the records that are held within the blockchain system, which makes legal responsibility and ownership really, really, really hard to determine. Yeah, there's other exciting stuff, jurisdictional stuff, PII, which for those of you that don't deal in that, that's personally identifiable information. So yeah. The PII protection issues, thank you GDRP, are the major barrier for adoption of blockchain-type solutions because everything has to be in compliance with the privacy, personal data protection, and given that the ledgers are immutable by design, if you put something in there that is PII, you are probably not scraping it off. There are other legal issues that I should mention. So, again, we talked a little bit about jurisdiction, applicable laws, identification, responsible parties. Yeah, might not even be possible. Managing consent for PII processing. So how do you revoke consent? Most of the time it's easy to revoke, but in the case of ledger technologies, not necessarily. Yeah, and there's almost very little general guidance on this right now. Again, we made the tech and we're not quite sure how we want to use it. or how exactly is the best way to use it in relation to how we have managed things in the past. Alright. So yeah, the most challenging are the public permissionless ones, so don't put your PII out on the blockchain, kids, it's not good. And definitely make sure you do your privacy by design, privacy by default. Always good to design software with privacy by default. Also good to conduct privacy impact assessments before you start deploying blockchains, which is identifying, analyzing, evaluating, consulting, communicating, planning the treatment of potential privacy impacts with regards to processing of PII. Oh, the joys of exciting PII. So, privacy information management systems can address management of personal information held across a wide range of operational units and information technology-based app systems. And then there's another ISO 27701 on governance models for such things. And basically, the key issue is how to put in place such an implementation across multiple organizations and jurisdictions. And that is on my control for you. All right. So they go on to access control mechanisms. Ooh, a nice happy sphere. Alright. So they can control access for write access as well as read access. So yeah, a typical mechanism for data integrity is to enable many separate parties to cross-check validity. Often this is achieved by having them unfettered read access to ledger records and being able to separately retain their own full copy. Which makes sense. Like, if it's not your record, you shouldn't be able to alter it. Not that you can alter anything on blockchain anyway. So, hang on. Just need to take a sip of something here. And then they get into how possibly private DLT systems might not even have sufficient read access control, because permission systems, again, will normally be used to support read access control. And the people you get the permissions to theoretically should not run amok in the rest of the system, but you gotta be careful with that. So obviously the great recommendation is don't record it at all. Just keep all the PII off the ledger and read access to the data using good old conventional technologies, like with the blockchain. And it goes into exciting other standards and references about cryptographic hash functions, but we'll just keep on moving. Then talks about encryption. So you can encrypt your data before storing it on the ledger, and if using sufficiently a strong encryption scheme, it will remain confidential as long as the decryption key remains secret to the parties who are authorized to read it. You can also do this blind signatures thing, which I have not heard of, but I could probably go look into, which in addition to supporting confidentiality, can also support integrity for some parties. But again, the limitation of all mechanisms is re-identification attacks using data and metadata of ledger records. Which brings us to writing access. So 3 main points of write access: transactions submitted to create new records, ledger updated by the node operators based on transactions, and the actual blockchain system itself. So typical mechanism is that the transactions are cryptographically signed using a private key, and the node operators check the signature, matches. Seems pretty obvious. They start going down the rabbit hole of self-sovereign identity, and I have not heard of self-sovereign identity. Perhaps that's related to the SSO, like deployment of use Microsoft Facebook ID everywhere. But they suggest that that can solve the issue with identification and authentication authoritative records, because an identified entity obtains control over its identities, including the core identity and attributes in the wallet, yet somehow without depending on the centralized authority. I feel like you need a centralized authority somewhere, though, because who else is going to verify where the heck you've been bored? Although I guess a whole bunch of that's been destroyed with some of the recent storms we've been having, so maybe that's a side issue. Anyway, sorry. So in comparison to existing identity management used in record systems, SSI, the self-sovereign identity thing, offers possibility to submit only your information needed to verify a claim about your identity. So I guess you can store all of your personalities in there and only submit the ones that you think will be useful. So yeah, I might go check that out. ISO 23249 for identity management. All right. So moving further along, how do you deal with the business need to modify any records? So you basically introduce a new transaction that amends the previous transaction by entering a new updated record. But the problem with that is that any agent relying upon the ledger needs to make sure that they have the latest version of the ledger. Seems kind of obvious. But if the system has a function that makes relationship between records explicit and easy to find and follow, that's a good approach for addressing the need for modification. So if your hash values are stored on the ledger, an approach to deal with the business needs to modify records is to simply add hash values of the modified ledger to the ledger as a new transaction. I know, you're sitting there going, exciting. Alright, let's click off this guy. Woo! This one I kind of like. It's trying to show like some sort of blockchain library or smart contract library. I don't know. I don't know what I was getting at there. Anyway, records destruction. Everybody's favorite thing. Everybody's favorite thing. Destroying stuff. Alright. So ledger records can have different retention requirements, retention periods, so accessing and using as a shared ledger, but disposition requirements can vary and apply to the same records. So blockchain systems may require a disposition or reconciliation mechanism. Ooh, that sounds fun. Smart contract capabilities offered by some systems can support automated, compliant, and documented destruction stored off ledger once the retention periods have been met. So that's a plus. And there's a range of strategies to address like this whole issue of records immutability, preventing like records destruction and resulting in like non-compliance, because some things, again like PII, you're supposed to destroy the information after a certain amount of time, like business use. So it's kind of like statute of limitations in that regard. So some suggestions they make are like making the system itself editable, so like relaxing the requirement that your ledger records be immutable, which I'm kind of like, then why are we doing that in the first place? Breaking links between like the off ledger and the on ledger metadata, which again renders things inaccessible, so yeah, I don't think that's a good one. Oh wait, I'm sorry, this is for destruction, so yeah, that would work. That would work. You break the linkage. And then you can do this cryptographic shredding, which entails encrypting records and then destroying the private key to render them inaccessible. Okay, that's what cryptographic shredding is. It sounds really cool. It's one of those things that sounds cooler than it actually is, probably. Alright, and an additional issue they note is that you have to figure out, again, because you have the distributed part of your ledger, that all the copies of the records and the metadata for the records across all the nodes have been destroyed. Oh, just think of it. Okay. And we also talk in the next one about, longevity maintenance. So longevity of like cryptographic algorithms over decade-long retention periods, because again, we're talking about big companies too, can be ensured by preservation mechanisms based on signing and rehashing the relevant data, which I know I said a little bit earlier that it doesn't, so... Ooh. How would that work? So there's this evidence of records syntax that does an archive timestamp for the root hash of the hash tree, which ensures efficient processing of large amounts of data. That hash tree can be reduced to a set of hash values called a reduced hash tree that's sufficient to prove the existence of a single data object, kind of like the Merkle trees. And then the archive timestamp can be protected by yet another archive timestamp, which is created with suitable new algorithms before the old algorithms lose their cryptographic strength. Once again, the joys of constant digital migration. The older I get, my gray hairs just came in, the more I'm sitting here going, print ain't that bad. It's hard to index, but I don't have to go in and like constantly remember like, oh yeah, my page years from my graduate school when I graduated way back when in 09 are probably in some form of Word that I need to migrate now. I've been that far out of good old archives class. So yeah. This is just further guidance on that in ISO 31000 and ISO 27005. Turtles all the way down though. Turtles all the way down. Alright. And also, a nice friendly reminder that ledgers can only be sustained if the nodes participate continuously in an ongoing way. Conversion changes to the bit structures and the hashes will also change. Oh, no, conversion changes your bit structures, so it also changes your hashes. And then the joys of timestamping. The joys of timestamping. I'm just laughing because I keep having fun side arguments with our international folks who are like, you Yanks, it makes no sense. It's day, month, year, like increasing order. And we're like, no, but you write it out as like the blank day of blank month, or the, February, month, day, year, February 23rd. Yeah. I don't know. I'm a Yank. I like me some non-standardized dates. The only way it's... Oh, well, the only time it's an issue is when they're both, like, underneath, I don't know, 20 or something. 24. I'm like, oh, is that a date? Or is that an hour? Or a month? I don't know. Anyway, I'm sorry, I'm not making any sense. Probably 12. 12 is probably the word I want. Anyway, we can tell it's almost time to go home. However, there is no trustwise, decentralized frame of reference to measure or record time uniformly. And I have a lovely comic over here, and I forget where it's from, but I'm going to recite it anyway. Time is an illusion, the past is only memory, and the future is only a metaphor for plans, hopes, and dreams. They are all human constructs, and physically immeasurable. So if there is no clear measure of time, how can it be wasted? Yeah. So sitting here listening to me natter on is not a waste. And also, if you are... a person of color can also throw back the, time is a Western creation that was maintained by colonials and further enhanced and, solidified through capitalism and the Industrial Revolution. Yeah. Resist the white man. We will all resist the white man and imposition of structure. Alright. So yeah, cryptographic timestamping is not really the problem of clocks, but like reliable consensus on what the order of events is. So you have to like find an external timestamping authority, and then the timestamps in the blocks are not really accurate representations of the time at which the transactions are. So timestamps recorded in one block are sometimes earlier than preceding blocks because it's based on when everyone else in the node approves your addition. And then we get into the exciting joy of key management. So again, I'm going to skim over this because the joys of key management, physical and electronic, we should all be familiar with in terms of like authenticating roles and security. They do have a nice little section here on privacy, and I'm trying to remember how many of these I have left. Okay, I have at least a couple more. So unauthorized users requires private keys illegally, can disguise their actions as if they're the owner, and impair the authenticity of records stored in the DLC system. That is one significant risk. You can also hijack the consensus algorithm, which is always fun. If the attacker takes control of the majority of the nodes, they can approve transactions and make things happen that you might not necessarily do if you weren't being manipulated. If you have to do patches are carried out to prevent exploitation, of course, but due to the decentralized nature, it's hard to determine all the patches have been applied equally to all the nodes. And to ensure like reliability and authenticity from the oracles, you need to audit or certify operation of service providers. Yeah, sorry. Just reading the definition of smart contracts, I'm like, what is that here? But you also have to keep in mind, again, cloud computing. So if you're storing your smart contracts on centralized virtual machines, they have the risk of being altered. If you only put them on a limited subset of your nodes, it can have reduced reliability. Yeah. Smart contracts containing procedural logic have been known to contain coding flaws and security vulnerabilities that can change over time due to various reasons. So you need reliable versioning control. You can also use data sourced externally via the Oracle, but it's not possible to guarantee the reliability or authenticity. And absent a human-readable contract documentation, it can be difficult to identify the exact terms of the transactions encoded in the smart contract. And then back to the linking. So linking to the ledger or the records they generate can be missing or broken, making it hard to interpret or use them for authoritative records. And there remains some uncertainty about how well smart contracts represent the will of transaction parties, because their creation relies upon machine encoding human-generated terms and conditions. And Lord knows, the machines ain't perfect yet. Smart contract can also encode procedures executed jointly by multiple stakeholders as part of work process, which can complicate, again, the attribution of ownership. It's not well understood if you can or how to revoke the effect of smart contract executions, and terms and conditions encoded in smart contracts are not inherently private. Alright, I got a few more. I want to make sure we get through all my pretty pictures. Alright, so auditing, monitoring, and evaluation, good, exciting things to do. But again, more unique challenges, so there's lack of a standardized specific frameworks, technical complexity of the systems, limited visibility, very much a black box for a lot of places. Verification of the off-ledger data, so again, there's a lot of pointers, and then you gotta go back and forth talking to these oracles, which apparently is an application that relies on the external data source. Okay, the data source itself is the oracle. Provide real-world information, but then you have to trust that the oracle isn't biased. E-discovery, again, mentioned this a little bit. Legal, technical issues, ambiguity, regulatory ambiguity, decentralization, lack of designated ownership. So, yeah, approaches to monitoring and evaluation will require some adaptation. Okay, so tokenization is essentially the creation, transfer, and management of digital representations of rights, assets, and relationships. Easy peasy, right? Each token represents a specific fraction or whole of the underlying right, asset, or relationship and is assigned a unique identifier. The tokens are then recorded for transparency, immutability, traceability, or exchange. Unfortunately, again, we're back to the challenges. So we have the lack of physical representation when it becomes a digital token, which can create a disconnect between digital and physical assets, raising concerns about ownership, verification, physical access, and disputes. Also raises questions about vulnerability of rights embedded in tokenized a tangible asset to cybersecurity threats that can lead to loss of those rights. Then there is the broken link problem, which again we've been over and back a few times. So while tokenization can represent ownership rights, a broken link can lead to the loss of the ability to exercise said rights. Authenticity, so you have to find some sort of mechanism to verify the existence and ownership of the underlying physical or digital assets associated with the tokens, which can involve linking of the assets to external source of information or conducting audits to validate their authenticity. Immutable records, another one. It's a pro, but if there are errors or fraudulent entries, it's a minus. Regulatory compliance, so, yep. Tokenized assets can be subject to various and sometimes contradictory legal and regulatory requirements. So, tokenization offers benefits, but there are a lot of challenges to be addressed before tokenized rights, assets, and relationships can be relied upon. Okay, and then they drop off into a bibliography. Let's see if I have any more pretty pictures to share with you. And I don't, so I guess that worked out. I'll just flash back on the one I like the most, and yeah, you guys let me know what you think of this. Hopefully it's coherent, if nothing else.